नाज़रीन, आप देख रहे हैं प्रोग्राम द रिव्यू कामरान यूसुफ और शहबाज राना के साथ। द रिव्यू में हम पाकिस्तान की मईशत, खारजा अमूर और नेशनल सिक्योरिटी से जुड़े मामलात पे बात करते हैं। जैसे आप खुद भी देख रहे होंगे कि आज हम स्टूडियोज़ में नहीं हैं, स्टूडियोज़ से बाहर हैं, और उसकी वजह यह है कि हमारे साथ आज एक खुसूसी मेहमान मौजूद हैं जिनसे हम पाकिस्तान की मईशत, जो मौजूदा सूरत हाल है, और आपको पता है कि पाकिस्तान की मईशत इस वक्त मुश्किल सूरत हाल से दो चार है, कई चैलेंजेस का सामना है। तो ये भी पूछेंगे आज के अपने मेहमान से, और वो अथॉरिटी भी हैं, कि वे फॉरवर्ड क्या है। तो बगैर मजीद आपका इंतज़ार करवाए, लेट मी इंट्रोड्यूस आवर गेस्ट टुनाइट। वी हैव विद अस Mr. Martin Reiser. He is the Vice President of World Bank South Asia region. Many thanks indeed for joining us tonight on the review. And let me ask first question, as we all know that Pakistan is going through difficult times as far as its economy is concerned. And the World Bank is closely working with Pakistan to, suggest way forwards. And we understand that the World Bank has suggested way forward to the next government how to deal with the economic challenges. Can you elaborate what are those proposals and suggestions that Pakistan can implement and deal with the problems?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be back in Pakistan, even at difficult times, as you said. We launched this week the Reforms for a Brighter Future initiative. And I think it's important that just to mention why are we calling this initiative? It's an initiative because it involves a discussion with a wide range of stakeholders in society, which has already started several months ago, and so this week was just the launch of the final product. But really what we want to do is not just make a proposal to the next government, but put a proposal out there just as Pakistan is going into general elections in a few months' time, for society to discuss these ideas, because it is our conviction, also based on experience, that unless people understand the purpose of reform, unless they own the reform, unless they push government for reform, it's much more difficult to sustain reforms and to implement them effectively. So the Reforms for Brighter Future, time to decide, set of policy notes really cover 5 important shifts. The first is to tackle the human capital crisis. That's a silent crisis. It's not sufficiently appreciated, but it has major implications for Pakistan's future growth, because children grow up with insufficient health, insufficient education to grow into productive adults. And as a result, Pakistan is not using its human potential sufficiently. The second is the fiscal crisis that is much known and talked about, and that clearly needs to be tackled for Pakistan to lower inflation, to lower macroeconomic instability, but also to have the resources available to deal with the human capital crisis. And then the third shift is really to open up the economy to more competition, to attract more investment, to make the economy more competitive, improving the business, regulatory environment, etc. And then 2 more shifts. One is in agricultural policies, and the other one is in energy policies. Both areas that have benefited from a lot of government attention, but in some ways that attention has been misguided. It's gone into subsidies that have not been used productively, and as a result, both sectors are operating less efficiently than they could, and are consuming more resources than they should, leaving insufficient money for the investment into increasing agricultural productivity and into expanding Pakistan's renewable energy sector, for example. So those are the 5 shifts that we're suggesting. They're not particularly new in terms of the themes that we cover, with the exception perhaps of human capital, which has not received as much attention in the past. But really what is new about this initiative is that we want to involve the whole of civil society in it.
Yes, Mr. Martin, the timing of your notes is very critical. We have not seen any such policy notes from the political parties. Those are going to contest upcoming election, but the notes are coming from the World Bank, which is very important. And I hope these political parties listen to the World Bank and the other people who are talking about reforms in Pakistan. The question is, why do you put the human capital above even the fiscal sustainability issue? Because all we hear in Pakistan, all we read in Pakistan is more about the fiscal sustainability, the debt crisis, but not about the human capital crisis. So what is the reason behind that?
Well, if you look at economic development, basically, across countries, around 60% of a country's wealth comes from its human capital. The richer a country becomes, in fact, the more the quality of its human capital, the quality of institutions matter, the less important is the physical and natural capital that a country has. And so, naturally, it has to be in the center of attention of any long-term development strategy. Now, obviously, it's linked to the fiscal crisis, because one of the reasons why Pakistan has done so poorly in human capital over the last 3 decades is that it hasn't invested much in it. I mean, collectively, health and education have about 2.5% of GDP. That's half of what India invests, and it's less than a quarter of what upper middle income and high income countries invest in human capital. So clearly it's a problem of resources. So solving the fiscal crisis, reallocating spending from wasteful subsidies, from tax expenditures, etc., towards areas such as human capital will guarantee economic growth beyond just being necessary for fiscal stabilization alone.
So you have mentioned about India. In 1980s, India and Pakistan were like equals when it came to the economic growth. But now India is far ahead than Pakistan. India is growing more than at 6% rate, and Pakistan is growing sometimes 5%, 6%, and there is no consistency, and we drop to 2%, 3%, sometimes even negative growth. So what is the difference between India and Pakistan? Why India is so far ahead than Pakistan right now?
Look, I think we need to go back a couple of decades. India had a major economic crisis at the beginning of the 1990s. It took that opportunity to do some fundamental reforms, to open up the economy, to increase competitiveness, to have the state retreat from some of the sectors in which it was very dominant, to accelerate privatizations. None of this was easy. It was sustained over a long period of time, but it had significant impact on galvanizing investment, on mobilizing additional domestic savings, but also some foreign investment that came into the Indian economy. I think the second is that India has, since that time, stuck to fairly conservative macroeconomic and fiscal management. Pakistan has repeatedly had to go to the IMF to seek bailouts. India, after that reform in the early 90s, has not had to do that because it's basically lived within its financial means. It has increased its revenues. It has therefore created fiscal space to spend more on priorities. It's increased public spending on infrastructure. It's also spending more on human capital, although even there India could do better still. And growth and macroeconomic performance are linked. It's much easier to have good fiscal performance when you're growing. It's very difficult.
So do you see the role of the political stability as a key factor which is there in India but not in Pakistan?
Well, I mean, political factors surely play a role in creating the sort of consensus around key pillars of an economic growth and development strategy. And what has happened in India is that some of those pillars, a basic, competition, market-based, open economic orientation, sound fiscal policy management. And I would mention a third factor that perhaps is important here. India, over the last 3 decades, has experienced a dramatic transition, demographic transition. Fertility rates have declined, life expectancy has increased, and as a result, what India is going through right now is the peak of the demographic transition boom. Right, where the share of the workforce and the aggregate population is increasing, the dependency rates are declining. That means households have more money to spend on and to save and invest, and don't have to just care for children or for the elderly. That is a temporary window. India could do more to utilize it. It has still not a sufficiently high labor force participation rate. But Pakistan is still at the beginning of that process because its fertility rate has not really declined that rapidly. So if Pakistan took measures in the human development sphere to bring fertility rates down, that would allow it also to go through that demographic transition. So that's a third factor. But I think it's a combination of these factors and the fact that they have benefited from enough consensus that despite of changes in government that we've seen, those basic pillars have been sustained over a period of 2 or 3 decades.
Since we are talking about India-Pakistan comparison, and you suggested, or World Bank suggested 5 policy notes, how critical is the regional connectivity? Because one of the issues or one of the reasons that people feel that Pakistan couldn't grow as otherwise it should have been, because Pakistan live in a region because of geostrategic political region. It could not realize the true potential of regional connectivity. How do you think this India-Pakistan tensions and lack of trade is really affecting Pakistan's economic potential and trade potential?
Well, I think surely it would help both sides if there was more connectivity and more trade, and we know, and I don't feel I should comment on the reason why there isn't. It would clearly be beneficial in terms of, in multiple dimensions. But I think we should also recognize Pakistan has access to the open sea. It could be a very competitive trading economy through the port of Karachi. The fact of the matter is that despite of having a reasonably good geographic location, Pakistan is one of the most closed economies in the world. Less than 9% of GDP go to exports. And that is a reflection of policy choices, making imports very expensive, creating incentives so that enterprises are basically disinterested in exporting. They focus on the domestic market. But also a regulatory and policy environment that creates all sorts of distortions that make it more attractive to invest in real estate than in productive activities, for example. And so the resources that Pakistan have are not used as effectively as they could. As a result, Pakistan's competitiveness is low, and its connection to the outside world through trade is more limited than it could be. And I think that's regardless of what happens in the region, because Pakistan could have access to markets in the Gulf, in Europe, and in other parts of Asia. So I don't think that is a primary limiting factor at this point in time.
So the higher duties are one of those things where, because of those higher duties and taxes at the import stage, the trade is restricted and there is a bias against the exports as well. So now there is another phenomena, the restrictions on imports because of our external sector crisis. So where do you see Pakistan after 2 to 3 years if this continues? We have higher import taxes and duties, and at the same time we have also restriction on the imports. So what is the message for the foreign business?
Well, I think, these things are obviously connected without solving your underlying fiscal vulnerabilities, and I think you can do that by looking at measures to reallocate spending in ways that are more promotive of economic growth, and I mentioned some of those, but also by broadening the tax base and bringing in more revenues. That would allow you then to have a fiscal policy that gives you the necessary buffers to manage a more market-oriented, a more open foreign exchange policy. Pakistan has gone through periods of badly mismanaging its foreign exchange policy. It's persisted with an overvalued exchange rate for periods of time that has badly hurt export competitiveness and done little actually to support domestic producers either, and has been very expensive because it has been only possible through either heavy import restrictions that increase the cost for domestic producers and exporters, or through losing reserves that create macroeconomic stability. So fiscal policy, monetary and foreign exchange management policy are linked, and they in turn are linked to your ability to have a more open market-oriented, competition-oriented, foreign trade orientation. And so what we argue, for example, in the reduction of trade duties is not to do it overnight, to do it gradually over time, because you can't afford fiscally to get rid of those duties immediately, but you can provide that perspective. And the one thing that investors really are looking for is predictability and certainty in the environment. They want to know, if you're going to put $1 billion down today, you know that you need a 10-year period to make a return if it's a productive investment. Any investor that is attracted with returns over, a year or two is probably in activities that are not going to be that great for economic growth in the long term, right? So you want that long-term orientation. Well, you're only going to get that if people believe that the environment in which they're operating is going to remain reasonably stable over that period of time. And that requires you to have the macroeconomic buffers as well as the commitment to maintain regulatory policies that Pakistan has been missing over the recent years.
We have to go for a break here, और break के बाद जब हम वापस आएंगे तो कुछ specific areas के हवाले से भी बात करेंगे, क्योंकि जो World Bank है वो कई सालों से पाकिस्तान को वो टैक्सेशन का मामला हो, एनर्जी सेक्टर हो, उसके हवाले से जो रिफॉर्म्स हैं, इस्लाहात हैं, पाकिस्तान को असिस्ट कर रहा है। और वो जो सजेशंस हैं, जो प्रपोजल्स हैं वर्ल्ड बैंक की, किस हद तक पाकिस्तान को जो मुआशी मसाइल हैं उनको उनसे निकालने में कामयाब हुए। ब्रेक के बाद इस पर बात करेंगे। ब्रेक के बाद एक दफा फिर आपको खुश आमदीद कहते हैं। हमारे साथ वर्ल्ड बैंक के वाइस प्रेसिडेंट साउथ एशियन रीजन के मार्टिन राइजर मौजूद हैं और उनसे हम पाकिस्तान की मईशत और वे फॉरवर्ड के हवाले से बात कर रहे हैं। Mr. Martin, as we understand that World Bank for decades has been advising Pakistan on energy and taxation areas, yet these two areas are the major impediments to ensure a sustainable growth in the country. Is there a problem with the World Bank advice or a problem with the execution of the governments in Pakistan?
Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that, some things have developed positively. We've seen tariffs moving closer to cost recovery recently. We've seen some reforms to introduce a general sales tax and harmonize it between the federal and the local level. We've seen the registries for property taxation updated. But those reform efforts were never enough to really get over the constraints that both energy and revenue have presented from a fiscal but also from a structural point of view. If you ask the reasons why, I think it's fair to say that both sides have to examine, did we underestimate the political difficulty of implementing some of the reforms? Did we think about the sequencing the wrong way? I mean, for example, in the energy sector, yes, tariffs have gone up, but the distribution losses and frankly, some of the illegal connections that lead to the distribution losses have not been addressed. Now, surely, if you ask the ordinary citizen to pay for the electricity bills, he will want to know that everybody is paying. That's an important issue, and it's now, I think, over the last couple of months, we've seen some efforts to tackle it. But really, to be sure that it works, it would be good to improve the governance of the distribution companies, bring in some professional private sector management so that that responsibility for collection gets taken out of the hands of local governments or politically connected state-owned enterprises that find it politically more difficult to enforce. So that's a clear sequencing issue. Increasing tariffs without improving collection is an issue. Of course, we've also have a legacy of high generation costs that are not so easy to bring down quickly. But Pakistan has huge opportunities now with the fall in the price of renewable energy and its hydropower resources. I think going forward, we will see energy costs fall significantly in Pakistan as a result of investing in renewables. That will also make the country less dependent on fuel imports. I think it's fair to say that 10 years ago that opportunity did not exist to the same extent because renewable prices were still much higher. And so, there are ways in which going forward things might get a little bit easier. The same thing on the tax side. I think it's fair to say that fundamentally resolving fiscal problems without looking at underlying economic growth is quite
Sorry
challenging.
to interrupt, Mr. Martin. Before coming to this taxation issue, on the energy front, one wrong advice by the World Bank or by any international lender, either it may be the IMF or the Asian Development Bank, but that cost a lot to the households. And because of some of lack of priority or wrong sequencing of these reforms, the electricity prices for a normal household is almost half of its total monthly income. So do you not think that it is the time for these IFIs to review their strategies vis-a-vis Pakistan? Because this issue of only addressing the problem through this electricity prices increases is not helping. And the circular debt is now almost doubled in past 5 years. And during this time, the electricity prices also doubled. So that clearly means that the price increase is not helping to address the core issue of the power sector.
I'm not sure that's true. I think circular debt in the power sector, for example, has reduced as a result of the tariff increases, so it's not gone up further. Now the same thing needs to happen in the gas sector. I think you also need to recognize, I mean, Pakistan has been, in some sense, as many other countries in the region and globally, hit by increasing global prices for fossil fuels. And because Pakistan is very dependent on fossil fuel imports, it has a higher energy bill. I think the third thing that I would say on this is that one of the key efforts of the World Bank in all of this has actually been to change the system of subsidies, of energy subsidies, so that at the household level, so that poor households are the ones that benefit from the subsidies. And now 60% of households are covered by subsidies that mean that their energy bills have increased by much less. It's true that you can't subsidize everybody. If you subsidize everybody, well, then the fiscal costs just get shifted from circular debt onto the budget. So you have to have some people that have higher energy bills. And I mentioned the issue of collection losses, of theft. Those are issues that need to be addressed. But I don't think I would say it was wrong to try and bring tariffs to the cost recovery level. If you don't cover your costs through tariffs, no one is going to invest in your sector. And so the people that will make those investments, let me just finish on that point, as in the past, will charge you a high risk premium, so you will have high generation costs. So you have to look at this as an integrated solution.
But let me rephrase a question. There is a general perception that, of course, when it comes to putting burden on the domestic users, these international financial institutions always put tough conditions. You also highlighted that why Pakistan's energy sector is facing a problem because of theft and the line losses. The question generally people ask, why can't the international financial institutions like the World Bank really put pressure on the government to make sure that they address these fundamental areas instead of simultaneously also recover the cost from the domestic consumers. So they feel that these international financial institutions are not putting enough pressure on the government to address the fundamental issues.
Well, I think I'm not sure I would agree with you on that. I mean, we had a whole energy reform series that was targeting exactly those issues. And when the government didn't move on those reforms, we suspended the loan. So I don't think you can say that we don't act or we don't put enough pressure. But at the end of the day, I think Pakistan, my sense is, I come back to what I said at the very beginning. What we want to do is make sure that people understand what are the recommendations that we want to make and have a chance to contest them, debate them. I think it's fair that you say you disagree. Fine, we can have a debate. What I think is a wrong perception is that it's the international financial institutions that drive economic policy in Pakistan. It has to be the government of Pakistan that drives that policy, and it has to be the population that contests the government and asks them to do, to take better decisions. And I would be delighted if, as the outcome of this particular effort, people would really, say, look, we need to solve this distribution losses problem. We need to get professional management into the discos. The people of Pakistan don't want to pay tariffs for other people to walk away scotch-free. So we need to get professional management into those companies. I think that would be a big signal also for government to start solving that problem.
So on the taxation front, despite so many efforts put by Pakistani authorities, people have been paying a lot of taxes. The World Bank is also advising, even Asian Development Bank is now considering a loan for the taxation reforms. Our tax to GDP ratio is still stagnant, and even it has worsened during the past 3 years, particularly under the IMF program. So what is the problem? Because all those recommendations are not helping to increase the tax to GDP ratio. Do you think it is the wrong advice that is to be blamed, or there is something fundamentally wrong with the Pakistani taxation system?
No, I think I think there's an insufficient broadening of the base. A lot of effort again has been on tax rates, etc., and not sufficient attention has been placed on broadening the tax base. In our efforts, we looked at a gradual process of first reforming the general sales tax, harmonizing it, then bringing in property taxes, modernizing the registries, and we were hoping to get to the question of broadening taxes on real estate and on land, agricultural taxation. The reform effort has been too slow, and as a result we have provided much less financial assistance to tax reform than what we had originally programmed. We will support reforms when they happen. We will not walk away from reforms when they happen. But at the same time, we could do so much more if there was a more consistent and deeper reform effort, and I think that needs to be the continued offer from our side, is that we're ready to support a serious reform effort, but I think we have reached a point where muddling through with semi-steps is simply not enough, and so we will be asking for a more coherent, a deeper reform effort going forward, because as you rightly point out, otherwise the effectiveness is limited.
Pakistan is also seeking a $400 million or maybe $500 million another loan for the energy sector reforms, and this is the phase 2, which is outstanding for quite some time. And one of the conditions for the phase 2 is to renegotiate the power purchase agreement with the independent power producers. So that means essentially and implicitly renegotiating with the Chinese IPPs. Why this is so much important for the World Bank to reopen the Chinese deals?
I don't think you could say that we have a condition on that, but we have in that reform program, we had pointed out the three interrelated issues that the energy sector faces: tariffs that don't recover cost, distribution losses as a result of technical losses, but also as a result of theft and inadequate collection, and high generation costs. And we argued that if you found a way to deal with all three, it would mean that you had higher effectiveness. And generation costs are in part a function of the cost of financing. So that's what we said. So that and that remains true. That if you bring the cost of generation down, you have to do less work on the tariff side. So, but those discussions have not advanced in recent months.
And if we talk about, the Chinese feel that even if there is a reprofiling of debt or reduction in equity rates, that would make a difference of hardly 50 billion rupees. But if, the issues of, the theft and line losses are addressed, that could save about 300 billion rupees for Pakistan. So they feel, their agreements with Pakistan is not part of the problem. The problem lies somewhere else. Do you agree with that?
I can't substantiate your numbers. Maybe my team can follow up with you. I would generally, I would come back to what I said earlier, the attempt to solve what is an interrelated and complex problem by just tackling one part of it and then hoping it goes well. I think we now have evidence that that doesn't work.
Okay, we have to go for a break here, और break के बाद जो पाकिस्तान के कर्जे हैं वो बैरूनी हो या अंदरूनी हो, एक बहुत बड़ा चैलेंज बनता जा रहा है. तो ब्रेक के बाद कर्जों के हवाले से बात करेंगे कि पाकिस्तान को इस मसले से कैसे निपटना चाहिए. ब्रेक के बाद एक दफ़ा फिर आपको खुशामदीद कहते हैं. हमारे साथ वर्ल्ड बैंक के वाइस प्रेसिडेंट साउथ एशियन रीजन मौजूद हैं, Martin Reiser. Mr. Martin, now let's talk about, Pakistan's debt problem. Recently, Pakistan's caretaker finance minister also publicly acknowledged that Pakistan's, the current debt is really unsustainable. Do you think that this is time that Pakistan should immediately go for debt restructuring, both for external and domestic public debt?
I think, we need to look at debt restructuring as in the context of the underlying, fiscal position and fiscal reform efforts. We published in our October South Asia development update, we published an analysis of past debt restructurings, external debt restructurings, and we asked the question, when are they successful? And we define success as the ability to reduce the debt to GDP ratio and the debt servicing costs on a sustainable basis. And it turns out that not all of debt restructurings were successful. In fact, more than a third of them failed to achieve either of those objectives. So what were the conditions that made it work? The conditions were a strong fiscal and structural reform program, usually underpinned by the IMF or some other anchor. And the second was a period of strong economic growth. It also helps if the world economy grows rapidly and if world interest rates are low. Under those conditions, debt restructuring efforts have been successful. I think, therefore, if Pakistan were to consider anything in that direction, it would want to make sure that it has dealt with the issues that it has under control. Namely, it had a credible fiscal stabilization program and it had a growth policy. And if you have those two conditions, then you can approach your creditors and see whether they would agree to a reprofiling that gives you a bit more space and gives them more upside because it reduces the risks down the road. But I think you want to do that very carefully. I think these things need to be really carefully considered because there are big risks, downside risks, to doing it in a poorly executed or designed manner. So thinking of this as a solution again strikes me as just looking at one side of the problem. The results will come from having a solid fiscal package, a growth-oriented policy. We talked about both of those in the past, and those two on their own will probably take care of the debt problem and reduce the debt to GDP ratio quite rapidly because interest rates will fall, because revenues should increase, because spending will be better allocated, and because growth, the denominator, will increase rapidly. But you can, under those conditions, you can always approach the creditors and see if you can get some reprofiling.
But do you think Pakistan's debt is unsustainable? Do you agree with the assessment of the finance minister? Because there is a lot of debate as well that he shouldn't be saying this thing.
Our assessment is that under the right policy framework, the debt is not unsustainable.
So the problem is that Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio is 74-75%, and it is projected to be 77% by the IMF by end of this fiscal year. The problem lies in the debt servicing cost, which is now equal to roughly 90% of the FBR revenues, projected revenues for this fiscal year. And it is, the entire net federal revenue after paying provincial share is gone for the debt servicing cost. So do you think the solution is the debt restructuring or doing something in areas where the debt servicing cost can be reduced? It could be asking the banks to lower the rates or reprofiling of their debts. That is the solution.
Again, you need to be, if you reprofile domestic debt, a lot of the banks will have negative equity. So then you need to think about how you're going to recapitalize the banking system. And if you don't do that, there may be crisis of confidence. You may have a financial crisis on top of a fiscal crisis. That's the last thing that you want. So I think you need to be very careful. At the end of the day, the high debt servicing costs are a reflection of the lack of fiscal policy credibility that the government has. Conversely, if you take measures to deal with the underlying primary deficit, so you move consistently to a primary surplus, that gives you a fiscal anchor on the back of which you can have a more stability-oriented monetary policy, inflation can come down, and policy rates can decline in the same manner. So I think there's a fairly traditional fiscal route to reducing debt servicing costs. By establishing credibility with the market. If you wanted to do it through a reprofiling of domestic debt, you would want to think very, very carefully about the implications that has on the banks, on the credit market, on the ability of banks to lend. And so I wouldn't rush into this as a short-term solution.
Okay, we have to go for another break here, और break के बाद हमारी discussion जो है वो जारी रहेगी. के बाद एक दफ़ा फिर आपको खुश आमदेद कहते हैं. हमारे साथ वाइस प्रेसिडेंट वर्ल्ड बैंक साउथ एशियन रीजन मौजूद हैं. मिस्टर मार्टिन, we have seen in recent years that poverty has really increased in Pakistan. The numbers in 2023 are also quite alarming, that lower middle income poverty rate has gone up by and reached 39 point, almost 40%.
That's right.
People feel that, or do you take the blame? Some people feel that World Bank and IMF policies are also responsible for the, increase in the poverty in Pakistan over the years.
I think that I don't think I agree with that. I think the main reason why poverty has been going up is that growth has been negative. I mean, it's very hard to reduce poverty when you don't grow. Of course, our efforts have been in the context of very low growth to make sure that the limited resources the government has are better targeted. And I do think we've had some significant progress and success in that regard. The conditional cash transfer program has made a huge difference in making sure that children can continue to attend schools, that health services are provided, and have given good income support to the poorest segments of the population. And likewise, in the case of energy, as we already discussed, the distribution of subsidies has moved from 2/3 of the subsidies benefiting the top 60% to 80% or 90% of the subsidies benefiting the the bottom 60% today. So a major shift that is really making a big difference in alleviating the impact that the economic crisis is having on poverty. But again, as I said at the beginning, hard to avoid an increase in poverty when your economy is in recession.
So, Mr. Martin, since 1988, Pakistan has been effectively under the IMF program. We have been actively engaged with the World Bank as well as with the Asian Development Bank. And still we have these fiscal imbalances issues. Macroeconomic stability is always under question. So with low economic growth rate, that leads to higher unemployment rate and higher poverty rate. Do you not think that these IFIs have also to take some blame for this low growth and high poverty?
I don't think this is about who is to blame. I think it's about what can be done to make it better going forward. That's what we're trying to do with these policy notes.
And that is not working. Despite repeated recommendations given by you people, this is not working. So do you think that there is a need to change the course this time?
I think there is a need to change the course, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we need a more coherent, consistent implementation of whatever program you decide to go. And I think there needs to be broader public ownership and stakeholdership in the reforms so that they can be politically sustainable.
This can be done with the IMF or without IMF?
I think I would hope that we can be a source of support. Most importantly, I think for the World Bank, because our financing is very small given the size of Pakistan's economy and its needs. We can only ever make a minimal contribution to that. But we do hope that Pakistani counterparts, not just in the government but more broadly in society, see us as a source of advice, of international experience, and that's really what we can bring to the table. But as you say in English, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. And I think that's sort of how I would describe the situation. But certainly, please, we are happy to receive comments on whether you think our programs have been ill-designed. I do believe we need to look at what we did and learn the lessons. I still do believe that the bulk of the recommendations we made 5 years ago in the Pakistan at 100, the recommendations we're making today are the right ones. But certainly, we are not the only source of truth. We're ready to hear other views.
Okay, last question. The policy notes the World Bank suggested, for the governments to implement. If, Pakistan implement, those policy notes and take other, measures, what do you see the future of Pakistan's economy? Do you think that we can grow like any other country? Previously people used to talk about that Pakistan could be an Asian tiger, could be, next South Korea. Do you see potential in Pakistan to be, ranked among those top countries?
Absolutely. Pakistan is, as I said earlier, has a young population. It has, industrious, entrepreneurial people. I think with the right policy framework, it has every expectation to go through a period of sustained, rapid economic growth. But it does need to take the necessary measures to put those frameworks in place, and that's what we're laying out. But we definitely see the upside.
Thank you
so much for joining us. ये थे हमारे साथ Mr. Martin Reiser, जो कि वाइस प्रेसिडेंट थे वाइस प्रेसिडेंट है साउथ एशियन जिस रीजन के, और उनसे तफसील से हमने बात की पाकिस्तान की मईशत में क्या प्रॉब्लम्स हैं, वे फॉरवर्ड के ऊपर भी बात हुई। प्रोग्राम द रिव्यू से इतना ही। मुझे कामरान यूसुफ और शहबाज राना को आप इजाज़त दीजिए। अल्लाह हाफ़िज़।